Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is 2019's RTX 2060. It's the lowest end or the most entry level first gen RTX card from Nvidia, and 7 years later it's probably the cheapest RTX card you can buy as well, apart from the 3050, the 6GB version, which is going to perform a little worse. Now what I like about the 2060 is it's probably the lowest cost way of getting into PC gaming if you want to be able to run absolutely everything. But how well does it actually play games? Now, as you know, there are some games that won't run unless you have a card that's capable of hardware based ray tracing. It's still not a super common occurrence, but there are a few examples. For example, Doom the Dark Ages here. That said, we will still need to implement DLSS and use a pretty intensive preset like performance in order to get it running. In fact, with Doom the Dark Ages, this one ran with about 50 to 60 FPS for a couple of minutes, and then the next time I booted the game up it ran with like 20. That was until I switched the upscaling method and then restarted, so bit of a weird one in terms of performance. Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition also looks fantastic, but it will require a ray tracing capable graphics card. That said, the 2060 being the lowest or one of the lowest RT capable options does mean that it's not going to pump out super high performance figures. In fact, with DLSS balanced enabled, we were seeing 48 frames per second. We don't quite have to drop to the levels of Doom the Dark Ages here, but there will still be some performance problems. Now the next couple of tested games don't require ray tracing to start, but I'd still probably recommend turning it off as performance will be quite poor. For example, The Witcher 3 with the RT preset and DLSS performance mode gave us just 31 frames per second with a 1% low of 19 and a 0.1% low of 12. The 6GB of VRAM definitely poses a problem when using intensive RT settings like this. I think the 2060 could be a better card than it actually is if there was more VRAM, and I think this is something we tested not too long ago with the rarer 12GB version of this GPU. That extra VRAM headroom allows the power of the 2060 to stretch its legs a little more. Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p with the RT Ultra preset and DLSS performance also gave us a frame rate in the 30s, though it was a bit better this time around. We're looking at 37 again with a few frame drops here and there. But the thing is, with a 2060, the 6GB version of the card, you are going to be limited to lower visual presets most of the time. And as I said, I think this would be a more powerful card had it had more VRAM attached to it. Back in 2019, sure, it was probably more capable, but these days we're going to see that VRAM limit hit in a lot, if not most cases, and that is apparent by the on-screen overlay that you're seeing at the center left of the screen. The 2060 is definitely a card that you're going to want to leave ray tracing off with. We'll run through some non-ray traced benchmarks now to show you what you can expect from one of these. Arc Raiders at 1080p with the medium preset here, and TSR gave us 77 FPS, so we weren't limited to the low preset. That said, dropping to low may be a good idea because it will alleviate some of the stutters that I saw as represented by the percentile lows. The 1% was 51, but that 0.1% figure was just 19, and every so often there was a bit of a judder with the performance, and I think this is VRAM related. I wanted to try and avoid any upscaling in these benchmarks so that you could get a true sense of what the card is capable of at native resolution. Battlefield 6 at 1080p surprised me, even with the low preset here. Of course, the high resolution textures are not installed. We also have TAA enabled, and overall we saw 89 FPS. I did try medium briefly, but we were getting drops below 60 FPS, sometimes way below depending on the map, and I think a game like this, well, you're going to want as high a frame rate as possible, and I think this was perfectly acceptable. 89 FPS overall with some pretty consistent percentile lows, 68 and 62. Counter-Strike 2 isn't very problematic for our 2060. You may have noticed that I've also paired it with my entry-level or modern entry-level CPU, my favourite i5-12400F. I think this is a more realistic pairing, and it also represents a system that is more affordable. I've paired this with 16GB of 3200 MHz RAM as well. I did think about pairing it with my i7 build and DDR5, but that feels like defeating the object a little bit, using what is now a more affordable card with what is still expensive RAM and an expensive CPU. Medium was absolutely fine for the 2060, delivering over 200 frames per second. GTA 5 Enhanced slipped into these non-ray trace benchmarks despite us actually enabling ray tracing here, as well as RTGI or ray trace global illuminations, which does totally transform the game in my opinion. That said, we were getting over 90 frames per second here with some solid percentile lows. 96 was the average, and I think it looks absolutely fantastic with the high RT preset enabled. I tried to push things to very high, but again, just like in Battlefield 6, we were seeing some pretty distracting dips and drops below 60 FPS. It's more tolerable in GTA 5, especially in third person mode, but I think if you're playing in first person or online for that matter, constant drops below 60 is going to feel a bit rougher. So sticking to the high RT preset is a nice way to play. Power World 1080p, this time around I used DX11, but it didn't really make any difference compared to DX12 that I tested briefly yesterday in our Minecraft recommended specs video. Here at medium we saw a pretty good average 92 FPS, but this was a little bit troublesome in terms of those percentile lows 43 and 16, and you can probably pick up the performance problems on screen as well with the MSI Afterburner and Reaver Tuner overlay. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, one of my favourites, again best suited to low preset because of the VRAM. Now you might be looking at this and thinking, well, 95 FPS, surely there's a bit more headroom to work with, so we could push things up to the medium preset. But I did this briefly, and while we were seeing 60 FPS a lot of the time, there were a lot of frequent drops below this, especially in and around towns and settlements with a lot of NPCs and other things going on. When I ventured into the woods as well, this dropped the frame rate quite significantly, and we can already see the VRAM struggling here. So although we are limited to low, I think it still looks good, and this is the best way to secure a more consistent gameplay experience. SMAA2TX was also enabled to eliminate any potential jagged lines. Cyberpunk 2077 again here, this time without RT at the medium preset. Medium crowds was also enabled here for 80 frames per second. It's a pretty good result for our 6GB GDDR6 graphics card. Our percentile low was 55 and our 0.1% low was 42. It's not as smooth as some other games have been, but it is still a very respectable experience from this aging entry-level RTX card. For Red Dead Redemption 2, I used my favourite Xbox One X equivalent settings as described in a Digital Foundry video quite a while ago now. 94 frames per second this time around with 74 as that 1% figure and a 0.1% low of 38. I noticed a couple of dips here and there, especially around Valentine, but for the most part we were seeing a very smooth experience, and the game looks really nice with these visual settings. It still holds up. It's a good example of what the 2060 was capable of at the time of its release. Forza Horizon 6 up next with the medium preset. I wouldn't recommend pushing this any higher for reasons that we've previously stated, but even in this multi-competitor race here we were seeing 77 FPS, a 1% low of 64 and a 0.1% low of 60, so this remained very smooth, and at the medium preset it still looks good as well. Oblivion Remastered up next. Of course, I don't need to mention that this is pretty troublesome on certain hardware. We were limited to the low preset here. I did use high reflections to make the water look better, but I had to use DLSS to get anywhere near 60 FPS, and we actually averaged above this. That said, it was sort of irrelevant because our percentile lows were just 19 and 6, so it's no good having a solid average if the game isn't smooth, and unfortunately that was the case here. We'll finalise with Fortnite, which is best played without Nanite or Lumen. Of course, with the medium preset, we saw 161 FPS. This wasn't entirely free from drops, but I'd recommend this preset as it still looks good and it gives us a really high frame rate too. You could probably push things to high if you wanted to, maybe with Nanite and Lumen, but for a nice mix of performance and graphical fidelity, with a 2060, I think medium is a pretty safe bet. But there we go. The 2060 6GB in 2026. I think I'd probably call this the minimum you'd need in order to play every game out now. Not necessarily the minimum you'd need to enjoy yourself, but if you want to guarantee that everything will run or start, then you'd probably be looking at perhaps a first gen RTX card or Radeon RX 6000 series like the 6600. Personally, I'm not that bothered about ray tracing, but I do like my games to start. I think everyone does. No one wants to be hit with an instant crash. The 2060 is of course still supported with drivers at the time of this video as well. Not sure how long that will continue for, hopefully for a long while yet, but I think for the money it's not too bad, though you may want to consider the super version with 8 gigs of VRAM instead. And it's always worth considering what other options are available at a similar price point where you live, and looking up the relative performance of those cars. But as for this one, thanks for watching, and let me know your thoughts on the 2060 down below, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.